Right. Hey guys, Beth Sevilla here. We're ready to start our webinar for tonight, which is on attachment and trauma, and it's going to be an overview of the book Wounded Children Healing Homes. So we'll go ahead and get started. Wounded Children Healing Homes is a book that I found at the library, and actually you can access it from the comfort of your own home if you get the Hoopla app. That's Hoopla, and I'll just type it in here to the chat. It's an app that basically connects with your library card and allows you to get books online for free. You can actually get albums and movies and other things too. So just putting that out there, you can look up the book on the Hoopla app, or you can get it from the local library. And so the book is about how traumatized children impact foster and adoptive families. And so I found the book very helpful. Some of it's very adoption specific. And obviously at Miracle Home Foster Care, our program is geared towards fostering families who are working towards reunification. Although we do have multiple families who have adopted, we've adopted. And so this book I found to be practical and also full of great information. So I would definitely recommend it. And obviously in an hour, we're not going to be able to cover everything that you'll see in the book. So here's an overview of what we're going to look at. We're going to cover multiple factors that are part of fostering and adopting. And so expectations is going to be one of the big things that we cover, what we go into fostering expecting, and then what we assume it will be like. Obviously, as believers who've gone into foster care, we know that you're motivated by your faith and you're motivated by serving children who God loves, but that doesn't mean that we don't go into things with maybe sometimes assumptions or expectations that would be unreasonable. We're also going to look at attachment, development, and trauma, and then the impacts of fostering on foster parents. And the author of the book, and it's a compilation of several people who write in the book, but the author has been in this field since before I was born. And so she definitely has a lot of expertise, and she talks about how the field is different now from even when she began, because children are more traumatized. They come to us with more difficulties than even when she started. And so it's going to play into the kinds of things that you are dealing with. So as I was saying, the children you serve are going to come with traumas, developmental delays, challenging behaviors. Sometimes we think about that word trauma, and if you have a child who's very young, or maybe you've got a child from the hospital who you feel like they weren't exposed to that much, but research shows that even trauma experienced in utero is something that's going to have long-term effects on children. And so what they call professional parenting, being a foster parent, it means that you're going to have to adapt and adjust to new situations that you may not have experienced with your own biological children, with your experiences with other children. And this quote that it's a commitment to a child you don't love yet and may not even like for a while, I think to some people that would be shocking. But if you've had any traumatic experiences as a foster parent, you'll know what that means, that you are choosing to love them and you're choosing to care for them because God has called you to that. But there are going to be times when you don't feel like loving them and you don't feel like liking them because of the difficult situations that you're dealing with. So let's look at some expectations and assumptions. And there are actually 10 of these in the book, but I used 9. And while it's certainly true that you need to love the child that you're fostering, that will certainly not be enough when it comes down to difficult behaviors and things showing up that you weren't maybe prepared for. And as we go through these, unmet expectations are going to be one of the things that can be a real challenge to fostering. And so going into it with any of these, we need to be willing to reevaluate them. So obviously, we will feel love and connection to the child quickly is something that can be a misnomer. Sometimes I think we think, every child is a child that can be loved, and so every child can give love back, but based on the things that they've experienced, it may be that they're putting up walls that are really hard to break down, and that it can take a really long time for them to open up to you. And there was one adoptive mom mentioned in the book that said, there wasn't a child who couldn't be loved. That was what she thought before she fostered, but that she felt these really surprising things. She said, it was something I couldn't tell anyone. I felt absolutely no connection to the child. I felt anger and remorse over bringing her into the family. And so those are the kinds of things that I think people don't talk about very often when they're struggling. And so understanding some of these expectations, I think, before you go into a new fostering situation, and even maybe while you're in the middle of it, can help you to know that some of those feelings can be normal and things that you need to be able to talk with your care coordinator or other friends who've been in the trenches with you, or who maybe are right now. And so that assumption that we're going to feel love and connection quickly is something that we need to be able to reevaluate. All right, so the third one is that this child will step into our family and easily learn how to function within our rules and goals and ambitions. And this one, I think, again, either you are in the middle of it or you're going to be at some point, but children are coming from all different kinds of backgrounds. And so what they viewed as normal in their family will not be maybe normal in your family. And so in the book, they talk about a caseworker who was really helpful in kind of constantly challenging the family on the regular visits that he would make. And he would encourage them to be incredibly flexible as they dealt with the child, because the child was new to their home and new to their way of living. And so just a good reminder that, if we're expecting them to just come in and kind of see how we operate and jump right in, that could be, could cause problems. All right, expectation number 4 is this child will have needs just like those of my children. And so if you've been a parent, you know what the needs of your children look like, and you may know things that have worked for you as far as discipline or encouragement, and it may be that these methods that you've previously used are not at all effective with a foster child, which can be very disconcerting and frustrating, and it can make you feel a little bit like you're failing. And so it's important to know that they're going to have different needs that have to be addressed very differently than maybe what you've done before, and be willing to try new strategies, think about different ways of doing things than what you've used previously. And it's going to be based on the fact that your children who've grown up in your home have not been hopefully exposed to the kinds of trauma that these children have. And so the way that they're going to respond to things will be different. The next one is that our biological children will accept this new child as a sibling. Sometimes, and I hope this is true, I feel like I've talked at least to some of you who've said, our children have just really jumped on board and are embracing the child, and that's awesome. And it's something exciting when you've passed on a vision for foster care, for loving the fatherless, for the fact that God has called your family to this really exciting but challenging endeavor. And some kids are going to get right on board and jump in depending on their age and how much they can adjust to that. But some kids are, depending on whether they're displaced in birth order, or maybe they really start to experience that this child requires a lot more attention than what they were expecting. And so they may come to resent the foster child. They may come to be jealous. They're kind of all different situations that can come with that. But we need to be aware of our own children and their responses and their needs to the fostering situation. And there's chapter 6 in the book covers this very specifically. And I think it actually has some words from biological children who were in foster families and kind of sharing their experiences. So this next one is that our foster child will fit well into our extended family and be welcomed by them. And again, this is one of those where I hope that many of you have experienced embraced by your families and found them to be supportive and helpful. But I do wonder how many of you, and maybe this is something, if you guys, I'm not looking at the chat right now, but you guys could certainly chat if you would like to, about this, that it may be that initially our families embrace the idea of us fostering, and then are very supportive to start, and then they start experiencing difficult behaviors on behalf of the child, and they start experiencing how those behaviors are affecting your family, your marriage, their grandchildren, and those kinds of things can make, whether they be grandparents or aunts or uncles, make them start to struggle with the idea that maybe this isn't a good fit, because maybe it's too much for your family, or maybe it's protection on their part, wanting to protect their nieces, nephews, grandchildren, and so they can start to pull away and become frustrated with the foster child because they feel like the foster child is impacting the family maybe too much. The next one is similar in that your friends and acquaintances will validate your role as foster parent and will support you. Again, I hope you're surrounded by a church body who's done this. I hope you're surrounded by other people who can encourage you. But sometimes people get excited about, maybe you're talking about fostering and like the idea, until they start to see some of the difficulties that come with it, or until their children are affected by your foster children. And so some of the quotes in the book that foster families actually shared that they experienced with their friends. So one of them was that, why don't you just send him back? You didn't expect this and shouldn't have to deal with it. Or, you're more than welcome to come over, but if you're bringing your kids, maybe you won't want to stay too long. Or another one, you're not the real parent anyway, so why don't you just call the agency and tell them to come and get her? So it kind of reminds me of, Job's friends trying to be helpful, but really said some pretty painful things. And I think sometimes they're not as blatant as those remarks. Sometimes it's a lot more subtle than that, but you can feel that, people aren't who we expected to be supportive, aren't as supportive as we may have thought. And so that can be pretty challenging. All right, this expectation number 8 is, and this one was a little bit more pertinent to adoption, but I did leave it in here. Our child will see us as his family and forget about his birth family and his past. So sometimes, I think back on 10 years ago, we were house parents at the group home, Miracle Hill Children's Home, and I remember being so shocked and kind of appalled by how connected the kids were to these parents who had abused them terribly. And that in particular just really kind of blew my mind. But what's true about fostering this kind of foundational reality that children have this innate connection to their parents, their moms in particular. And so they're very likely the parents are on the child's mind and heart, even if they're not talking about it. And even if they weren't really even old enough to have conscious memory, is what the book talks about, that even if that's true, their parents are still going to be in their mind. And so being willing to acknowledge that, I thought this was helpful. They talked about a child who was asking foster mom about, do you think my mom is thinking about me? Today's my birthday. And I found this a helpful response. I think we want to be truthful with the children we're serving, but not discourage them. And so the response given was, I don't really know for sure. I would sure think so, because today is a really important day. But, what is also important is that I think about your mom sometimes, and I bet you do too. Do you want to talk about it? And so just opening up the conversation for them to know that it's safe for them to think about their parents, to talk about them, is a healthy thing for them to be able to share those things with you as the foster parent. And this last one is that we will never feel regrets or ambivalence or any negative feelings toward this child with a traumatic past. And as someone in the trenches with going through some difficulty with our adoption situation from a child who came from foster care, there are going to be really trying times if you're in this very long, if you have a child for very long. And so people who our professionals who work with adoptive families agree that stress and depression and ambivalence and anger are emotions that are frequently seen in people who serve foster children or who go through adoption experiences. So here's a quote from the book. So this is an adoptive mom talking. "I dreaded getting up in the morning and facing the tasks of the day. The honeymoon period had dimmed. I was exhausted and overwhelmed, and I gradually grew resentful of them. But I kept my fatigue, depression, and anxieties hidden. I kept asking myself, what have we done? Of course, it wasn't the girls. It wasn't these kids who they had adopted. I had neglected to communicate my own needs. That was the wrong approach. I just didn't want to appear to be a failure." So this part, I think it's important to put a plug here, say that if you're dealing with things with your foster children that you feel overwhelmed by or feel like, are really a struggle for you, bring those things up sooner rather than later. That Miracle Hill, your care coordinator, would love to talk with you. They may not have all the answers, but they certainly will pray for you and reach out and try to find resources as well that can serve you well in your times of struggle. And maybe they know someone who's gone through something similar and can connect you with that person, or maybe it'll just be someone who can be a source of support and encouragement and empathy. But it's important to be willing to talk about those things, because the further you go in not talking, the more of a struggle it will become. Just like many things, if we cover them up, it just gets worse. And I think when you have gone into fostering excited and really passionate about what you're going to be doing, and then you start to experience some really challenging things, it can be hard to admit those things, because none of us wants to admit that we don't have it all together, or that maybe we went into it not prepared for what was coming. But that's a natural part of the foster parent experience, I think, is realizing that there are things that you couldn't have been prepared for, and that it's a growing process as you go. So it's important that we're willing to assess our expectations. Some of you have been foster parents for a long time, and so you may not even remember, looking back 10 years, what it was exactly that you thought going into it, because you've already had to adjust. But for those who are more recent, I would just encourage you to think about, were they reasonable expectations? How have they maybe had to change or adjust since you've started? And then are you willing to kind of reframe them now, even as you think about ways that maybe you had unrealistic expectations? And then communicate with your spouse if you're married, because foster care and the experience of parenting traumatized children can have a major impact on your marriage. And then communicate with people around you who can be a source of encouragement and support. So we're going to move into this part about trauma, attachment, and development. So as I said before, sometimes we think, trauma is such a traumatic sounding word. And so, did my child really experience trauma? But just by nature of being in foster care, they've been removed from their home, removed from their parents, their family of origin. That in and of itself is a trauma, and add that to anything else that they had experienced previously, and there is trauma in their past. And so trauma and attachment and development are all interconnected. If a child has early trauma, their attachment is affected by that and impaired, and then attachment has an impact on development. And so you kind of can't talk about one without at least touching on the others. And it is essential to address the trauma from a child's past. Denying it is going to hinder proper healing and development. And then it really is, it's going to help you as you think about parenting strategies for what the child's been through. So the central purpose for developing attachment for young children is to ensure their safety. Once safety is guaranteed, other aspects of childhood can proceed. And so you think about, your own experience. If you were a parent of biological children, from the time that they're an infant, you're meeting their needs constantly, and so they form that healthy, safe, secure attachment, and that's the foundation on which everything else grows. But if that's not started at the beginning, then they're really starting out behind. So I'm going to read a story from the book. It's a little bit long, but I hope it'll be helpful as we think about this idea of trauma and attachment and how it's going to affect development. So Tommy was born healthy and chubby with a bright, looping cry that alarmed his young mother, Brandy. She thought at first an agitated donkey had wandered into the delivery room. Other than the hospital staff, Brandy was alone in the delivery room and alone when she took the baby home to her small apartment. Brandy was neglected throughout her life, and she was determined to give her baby what she did not get, namely love, and more love. Love was hard to find at 2 a.m. when Tommy's screams jolted her from slumber. He seemed to cry more than he slept. Tommy appeared to Brandy to be a writhing ball of need. His cries were relentless and undeniable. She prided herself in not being like her old group home peers, who naively believed that having babies would fill the gaps in their lives. She knew babies were hard work. She was also determined that no matter how tempted she might be to repeat her mother's mistakes, she would by sheer willpower be a good mother. But sitting dazed, confused, and edgy from sleep deprivation, Brandy held her fretful baby and wondered whether she was capable of surviving the next few moments. Brandy wished she were dead. She felt an instinct bubbling up from deep inside, something she had felt all her life, the instinct to escape, to hide under the covers. She fought it off for a while, but after a month, she found herself leaving Tommy alone when she went to see friends, when she went drinking, when she went on to find love from uncaring lovers, and when she just couldn't get out of bed. Tommy's little body needed food, water, and comfort, and the way he experienced these needs was whole body distress. The only way to relieve the distress was to reach out to someone via his incredibly effective cry. But Brandy's absence meant Tommy's body remained in a state of distress. His developing nervous system never settled down, never trusted that distress would be relieved. Brandy was not there to gaze into his sparkling eyes, to anchor him to the blurry and undifferentiated world around him. He was alone in a strange, unpredictable, and unresponsive place. Tommy could not develop properly because he could not do it alone. He was removed from Brandy's custody by the CPS DSS, following several incidents where he was left alone and neglected. By the age of 5, Tommy was adopted. He displayed a variety of delays, along with terrible tantrums and a profound lack of trust in others. He rarely talked, gorged food, set his new parents' basement on fire, and threw the kitten down the steps. His parents committed themselves to learning as much as they could about the effects of maltreatment. They devoted themselves to helping Tommy's brain and body get back on track. And they patiently empathized with him, validated his feelings, and relieved his distress. They understood why he acted the way he did. They understood that his behaviors were survival techniques. For the first time in Tommy's life, someone valued and understood him, and over time he felt connected, supported, and safe. He could finally relax and others take care of him. He was no longer alone in the world. So I think that's a pretty powerful story. Tommy, in that story was missing the anchor that is attachment. The author of the book talks about starts at conception. A baby is a fertilized egg, which the very first act that the baby makes is to attach to its mother's womb. And so it's the key to the baby surviving that first journey and then becoming an infant, later. And so from that very first act of attaching, there will be more and more attachment that has to grow. And so attachment is the key to development and survival. And there are several areas that can be affected by trauma that are related to attachment. First, let's talk about what attachment is. So you saw the anchor on the previous page. So basically, it's a human's anchor in life. And that's kind of a good way to remember it. So a child who has healthy attachment, they have a safe foundation on which to build their understanding of the world around them. Attachment is the foundation for neurological, emotional, behavioral, cognitive, social, and physical well-being. So many of you have probably had attachment training before, but basically from the time an infant is born and then has needs that they express through crying or distress, those needs are met, and so they learn that the world is predictable and safe and that their caregiver is trustworthy. They experience these things that show them that they have someone who's going to take care of them, and so that's kind of where attachment starts. But if that doesn't happen, then the attachment is disrupted. And so children learn to understand the world around them from that foundation. And so it's going to impact a variety of areas, which we'll look at. And having the knowledge and the perspective where you're understanding that attachment is foundational to development, it can help in the really difficult times to offer hope that the attachment, although it was disrupted, can be overcome, and that we can see things clearly. We can see behaviors clearly that are difficult to deal with. And if we look at behaviors outside of the context, outside of having the knowledge of what attachment is and how it's affected by trauma, and without the perspective that this child's behaviors are rooted in some of the trauma he's endured, it can feel very hopeless and like we're never going to get anywhere. And so it's important to have those things as a foundation, especially when you're dealing with children who come from traumatized backgrounds. So let's look at some facets of development that are affected by early trauma. So genetics is the first one that they talk about. And so obviously a person has a genetic code. He's coded for certain development, and it codes a lot of things about him. But as you've probably been exposed to this truth that the brain is malleable, and so early experiences in life can impact the brain while it's malleable as it guides the genetic process. And so even genetics can be affected by early trauma. Similarly, there's this idea of pruning. And so the human brain has all these neurons that it's not going to use. And I'm certainly not a brain scientist, but this is helpful to think through that you've got all these, your brain is preparing for the rest of your life. And so early interactions during your infancy and childhood will activate and then prune away the unnecessary potentials in the developing brain. And so things that the brain doesn't think are essential to survival will be pruned away. And so obviously in a normal child, that's a healthy thing because they're getting rid of potentials that don't need to be there. But in a child who experiences trauma, something like remorse, which we kind of think is innate, something that is just part of what we develop as people. Sometimes a child's development that's not included because it was pruned away. And so we can see that if a child's not cared for by loving parents, then that would be one of those things that would kind of go away. And then we look at it and behavior and see, there's something wrong with this child. They never seem to have remorse. But again, you've got to go back to kind of the foundation and see why it may be that a child doesn't have that. All right, this next one, the gaze. So a child who doesn't experience the loving gaze of a parent can't develop in a healthy way. And so you hear stories about, children who are in orphanages overseas who never get held and never get the attention of a person, really interacting with them. But even in the United States, if a child is neglected for long periods of time, then that is something that could even be lacking for them. And so it is a pretty important part of childhood is that face-to-face interaction. And if they're missing it, then they're missing one of those building blocks for their attachment and then development. Emotional regulation. So the ability to tolerate and control stress is dependent on a child having their needs consistently met by parents or caregivers. So a child whose needs are consistently met understands that the world operates in this reliable way that he can trust. And so when that does not happen, then the emotional regulation gets broken because they don't find that they can trust, and they don't find that the world is predictable or safe. Oh, we just missed a page. Hold on. Okay, so survival. So you've heard about the three, responses that we have to threat. So there's fight or defend, there's flight, which is escape, and then there's fright, so play dead. So if you've ever gone through something very scary or very traumatic, or if you've gotten a phone call and gotten really bad news, or had a very intense medical diagnosis, then you know what that feeling of your body being heightened, so adrenaline and probably other hormones that our body, was designed to have a sense of protection. But if your body remained in that state constantly, you can imagine how that would mess with you. It would make you feel really awful, and your body is not meant to be in this constant state of adrenaline rush and dealing with the fight, flight, or fright sensations. And so, when matched with an appropriate attachment, those reactions are controlled appropriately. But without attachment, a child's brain, just stays in that state of threat. And so he starts to learn to respond to life in that mode. And so some people have probably experienced, a normal thing that you're doing, but the child reacts really strongly. And you kind of don't know where that came from. But sometimes that's because of the survival instinct that they have that's been heightened for such a long time. The next one is the socialization and shame. So shame is a healthy and normal part of early childhood development. It's part of what teaches a child good and bad behaviors. And so it can help them to be appropriate. And a child should experience shame that goes with a bad behavior, and then they should experience repair of the relationship. So I think about my son when he was probably less than 2. We were walking outside and he was holding my hand, and he took my hand into his mouth and he bit down real hard, and to the point that my finger was bleeding. And so my reaction was very, I think, shocking to him. And you've probably experienced in a child where they, just total emotional breakdown because he just was so sad at my response. And, he experienced shame. He experienced that mommy did not like getting her hand bit. But after that, after I was able to say to Levi, you can't do that, that hurts mommy. And then there was lots of hugging and lots of mommy loves you, and you're okay, and I forgive you, and everything's fine, in words that a 2-year-old would understand, or less than 2-year-old. And so there was the shame response, but then there was this repair, which is the way a child should experience shame. And so when that doesn't happen, they can start to self-loathe and view themselves wrongly. And then their sense of self. So an infant is entirely dependent on their caregiver, and that's the anchor in the world. So healthy attachment actually enables the child then to start to develop their own sense of who they are. And the way they described it is that, we say no a lot in the Terrible Twos, although probably you've read books that would maybe tell you not to use that word as much. But the fact is that that's a sign that the child is developing healthfully and appropriately, because they are trying to develop their own sense of self during those terrible 2 years. And so it's just a normal part of human development. So let's touch a little bit on trauma and behavior. So disrupted attachment, as we said, will mean disrupted development. And the disrupted attachment comes from those early childhood experiences of trauma. So if trauma is experienced during attachment, during that phase when a child should be attaching, it's going to affect those different aspects that we talk about: emotional, behavioral, social, cognitive. And then children who have endured trauma are survivors. So what their response often is a way that they can resiliently attempt to adapt to an unresponsive, threatening, and unpredictable world. And if you think that these young children are having to have those kinds of responses to the world, certainly makes us grieve to think that a child has to go through those things in order to feel safe, but they're not getting their safety anywhere else. And so that is the reality, is that the trauma that they've been through is going to create some behaviors that can be really challenging. And so we have to kind of shift our thinking, because some of those what we would normally term behavior problems in a child who maybe had grown up in a healthy home, had healthy attachment and development. For a foster child, are really survival skills. So listed a few of them out here. So manipulation and lying, hiding things, sneaking things in and out of the house, hoarding food, or other things. So when you view those in the context of trauma, we have to start assessing, are these born out of something that the child has endured? And is it because of something they've been through and because they developed a skill that actually at the time was a means of their survival? So obviously at face value, these behaviors seem defiant, but we have to look at what the root of those behaviors are and if they're grown out of this innate desire to survive and what it was that maybe led them to those behaviors. And then it's also kind of is helpful in offering hope. In the book, it said that because we can see the child's behavior in a meaningful context, if we view it in terms of trauma, we can begin to fathom the complexities of human development, and so we can begin to appreciate our adaptability and our drive to survive. And so some children are very naturally resilient, and their survival skills will not look maybe as heinous as those of other children, but either way, there are going to be behaviors that you have to deal with that come from that. All right, so, the question, are you dealing with personality problems, behavior problems? And so this quote I found helpful. Early and prolonged trauma impacts the developing child and reorganizes his adaptive systems towards survival. What eventually appear as problems in functioning are in fact the child's resilient solutions to a world he expects to be unpredictable, unreliable, and ultimately dangerous. So when a maltreated child behaves in a way that seems maladaptive, it is tempting to attribute behavior to the child's personality. However, the victim's problems and functioning are a response to trauma and not from underlying personality. So I think it is important. I think as Christians, we know that we have sin in us, and that's part of the human story, and that's why we need a Savior. That's why we're thankful for Jesus Christ. But in particular, if you're dealing with children, in your own children, if you have them, that you start to see that sin nature come out pretty early. But when we're dealing with foster children, we have to have context. And so, yes, they do have sin nature, and we don't excuse sin and bad behavior, but we need to come at it from a perspective that understands where it's coming from. So it's critical to try to find the reasons for their behaviors so you can address their actual need and not just the missteps you're seeing. And then there's a quote there from a foster mom. Don't know where to begin, but we weren't thinking about, what the actual needs were or where the things were coming from. We just wanted those behaviors to stop. And so at this point, I think it can feel a little bit daunting because really, excuse me, you don't know always where those behaviors are coming from. And I think a foster child is a lot like an onion. You're peeling back layers all the time. And so obviously with a really young child who can't say those words to you, there are going to be some things that you can't know concretely. But I would just encourage you to find out as much as you can from the DSS worker and just keep asking questions and keep exploring and try to learn as much as you can about trauma and how it impacts behavior. Let's go on to this. Whoops. This next one is about the impacts on foster parents. So later in the book, it starts to talk about this. And I think probably this is one part of the book where maybe there aren't as many other books written that address this, and so I found it helpful. So it's talking about how, because you have compassion on a child or for a child, you're going to feel with them. And so their trauma will come to affect you, and entering into their pain comes at great emotional cost to the foster parent. And so that's something that we put on ourselves when we become foster parents. And so this is chapter 5 in the book. And so I think it helps to validate some of the struggles that you face as foster parents and could be pretty helpful. So it talks about how, the behaviors that you can encounter can cause this unfathomable drain. So it's a drain that I think most of us don't anticipate. And so, and the fact that it can impact your relationship with your spouse, with your family, with your own children, can be really hard to contend with. And so the quote from the adoptive mom was just that, supporting these adopted children as they struggle, despair, and push against us is at times utterly consuming and exhausting. I felt deeply hurt and hopeless. And obviously, we want to move past a point of hopelessness, Lord willing, to a point of hope. But knowing that people who are writing this book have been there, I think is helpful to know that some of those struggles, if you're able to make it through them and move forward, and just knowing that other people have been there can be helpful. So every child has a story. We talked a little bit about this before, that children who enter foster care have some kind of trauma, and so their trauma is going to affect you and it will change you. They're going to carry emotional memories and traumatic memories into their relationship, and so those memories that they carry into the relationship will have an impact on you. And so it's something you have to prepare yourself for, because it could be that those are unhealthy changes and not good changes. And so it's good to be aware and kind of watching your own emotional responses. So there's this, they talk about the frog in the kettle. And so you've maybe heard before that if you put a frog into a pot of boiling water, it will leap out right away to escape danger. But if you put a frog into a nice cool pan and then heat it up to the point of boiling, you won't notice it until it's too late. So the frog's survival instincts are made for detecting sudden changes, sudden danger. And so they use this frog in the kettle. It's often used to illustrate how humans have to be careful to watch slowly changing trends in the environment, not just sudden ones. So as things change around you slowly, maybe you're not as aware of them. But it's a warning to us as foster parents to keep paying attention to not just obvious threats, but things that develop more slowly. And so I think being aware of your own emotional thermostat, if you will, is a healthy thing to watch for. They give this kind of recipe for disaster. And so you've got a loving, excited, potentially unprepared family. You have a child who has this significant trauma in their background and has developed these survival skills, which often translate to behavior problems. And then you have a cool and pleasant home environment, a home that is doing well. Generally, foster families who come to us and want to serve children have healthy homes, healthy relationships, love God, love each other. And then you have this emotional thermostat that no one's paying attention to. And so that starts to rise. And sometimes as it's going up, it's happening gradually to a point where people aren't aware of it. And so, child meets family, brings these survival skills. And one example they give is you bring a child into your home who has learned that he can't trust adults. And so a child who thinks he can't trust adults is going to be very prone to lying. And so he lies and he tells foster parents what he thinks they want to hear. And then they realize he's lying and think, this kid is deliberately lying to me. What is wrong with him? And those kinds of things, those kinds of experiences over and over and over, when a child is displaying these behaviors, that can really cause the thermostat, the emotional thermostat in the home to just keep going up. And so before long, after several experiences like this, the family is sucked into a negative cycle of relating to one another, foster parents with child with foster parents, and the thermostat can begin to overheat, is the way that they described it in the book. And I think it's just helpful to kind of be aware of where the struggles could come and be prepared for the thermostat to rise, so you're prepared to respond. And so they offer these 3 responses to the rising thermostat. Believe and validate the child's experiences. I think it's important sometimes maybe part of us hopes or wishes that some of the trauma wasn't true, and so we don't really want to accept the fact that the innocence of this child was taken away. It's not something we want to dwell on, because it means we have to feel it as well, to a certain extent, but that it's important that we believe it and validate for the child, but also for us as we respond to and deal with the behaviors, and then tolerate the child's behaviors. Now, as a young mom, that would have totally shocked me. I was a very black and white kind of person, and so rules are rules, and we don't tolerate behaviors. But as a foster parent, you have to learn to be flexible. And so you're going to be dealing with behaviors outside the sphere of your previous experience. If you've ever worked with children, if you have children of your own. And so this certainly isn't a license for them to do whatever they want to do. And it doesn't mean you deal with the same behavior forever by just tolerating it, but that you're going to be working through issues little by little, and that you're going to be needing flexibility to deal with those behaviors in a way that understands that, yes, they would be unacceptable in other circumstances, but that we're going to work through these things slowly and maybe address one thing at a time and not try to hit them all in one fell swoop. And then manage your own emotional response. So they acknowledge that this is the most difficult thing to do. I would say that reaching out for help and encouragement is essential as you're trying to manage those responses, and having other people who can kind of pinch hit where necessary if you need to take that break, or need to just have some time where you can get back to a place where you are ready to jump back in emotionally. So whether that be respite or your husband coming in and giving you a 10-minute break, just be willing to ask for those things, and ask early and often, and don't let it get to the point where you're in a point of despair or just throwing your hands up. And finding tools that work for you. Find ways that you can deal with your own emotional thermostat in a way that controls the response. And then I think ending on a little note of hope. So although foster care can be extremely challenging on foster parents and can obviously make the emotional thermostat in the home rise, there were parts where there's a section where they talk about personal growth that was experienced by these foster parents who had gone through some really difficult things. And so these are areas that they've identified that they've grown in. And I think that we can be looking for areas of growth in ourselves as we walk through this foster care journey, and be praying for one another and praying that God would work in us for his glory, but then also more Christ-likeness, and then in these practical areas, insight and understanding, so more compassion, more awareness of people around us, and compassion towards their needs, and then perseverance. I think if you've been in this very long, then you'll know that perseverance is kind of an essential element of fostering, and something that I think you'll grow in as you move forward. And then openness and improved family communication. So being a foster parent means that you're going to be strategizing, whether it be with your spouse or if you're single, trying to communicate with others around you who can be a support to you. That being a foster parent will improve those areas in your own life. And the family communication quote from the book said that they believed that they had become better people because of the valley of discouragement that they had been through. And so I thought that was helpful to kind of think about, not just the difficulty, but some of the positive things that can come out of it. So thank you for joining us for the webinar. We're all done. And again, the Hoopla app, if you're interested in the book and don't want to run to the library, you can find it on there. And if you have any questions or feedback that isn't covered in the assessment or the evaluation, then please shoot me an email. And I look forward to having another webinar. We're planning to do one in August, so we'll look forward to that. Y'all have a good night.